Today I'm going to take you on a tour of an experimental image layout editor called Tile. It lets you lay out images using a tiling tree layout, which I'll talk a lot about, and you can move, split, and resize those images using keyboard controls. It's part of a series of experiments called constraint systems, all available at constraint.systems. Lots of experimental image editors and text editors. And you can see demos of them, and you can also launch them because they're all on the web. So this is Tile. This is the default image here. A little bit of background or motivation on why I did this. I use a tiling window manager called i3WM, or just i3 for Linux. I've been using it about 6 months, and I really like it, especially in comparison to the more traditional window manager system of floating windows that you move around and can overlap. In tiling, you're splitting up a space, you're splitting up the screen, and then you can open apps within those tiles that you split. So i3 is running here. So just to quickly show that, if I do mod plus enter, I can open a terminal. And anytime I'm opening, depending on what tile I have selected, it splits that space and opens a window there. So I like that. I like thinking about tiling. So this was partly to explore that, and I wanted to write some of the tiling logic myself in terms of splits and movement, which I'll get a lot more into. And then also, it's just an interesting way to think about space and layout. A lot of the constraint systems projects, which I'll switch back to here, this Automadraw, have a cursor that is within a grid, and you can draw with that cursor, where you're drawing from the outside in. Drawing from the inside out in these instances with the grid, you're making a design and building out from a starting point. In contrast, with tile, you're starting from the outside. Maybe I'll clear a bunch of these out. So it's really like i3, it's this big window space that is your canvas space. And then you can split that. Let's even clear out the images. You split that. You can split it again. You can split it again. You can split these. You can move around to get 3 across. Make these different arrangements of squares, all splitting things up. So that, I don't know, it's just interesting to me. It feels like a somewhat natural way to split up space. It reminds me of folding paper into sections. And obviously, like, you can build grids this way, so it has its history in graphic design. But it also feels definitely different from defining a grid based on like pixel intervals, and that grid goes out. This again feels like going outside in. It's really hard to articulate exactly how it feels different, especially so I do front-end development, and I'm used to, there are proportional splits in CSS. You can define space in terms of percents, which is like, seems or does fit very well with tiling. But I still think this feels different, i3WM and tile itself, because the splitting mechanism is such the primary interaction. I think when you're setting up a layout in CSS, and this definitely makes sense, you maybe do a sidebar and a main window, but then you get into more defining a container of text and get into building from the inside out again. But this always kind of has you thinking about splitting and moving, and it just feels different. And that was really interesting to me, that this both kind of feels familiar. It's not something that I have no frame of reference for, but the logic to it's not obvious, and that makes it interesting enough that it's something I want to explore. I'm just doing a bunch of random stuff here. So that's part of the interesting to me. It also, like, very connected. um, but kind of vague. It feels very true to what a computer is, which is an issue in idea I'm always interested in that is always kind of fuzzy. Um, but I think what it is, it also feels very tool-like to me, very utilitarian. And I think part of what that is because like none of this stuff is necessarily true, but a screen is a rectangle and something about splitting that space into more rectangles, um, especially because this uses a canvas element and canvas, and I think a lot of things that draw images are really, a lot of times you give that XY width height coordinate to draw something. It just feels like a lot close to what the APIs of some of the computer lower level programs are made to do, and that makes it feel um, more with the grain, I think, is the Frank Camiro essay about designing for the web. All of that is like pretty subjective, and I know I'm being a little vague about it, but it is an issue I'm fascinated with and want to keep exploring, even if I can't always describe it. All right, so that's some background, and then I've also just been doing weird kind of fidgety stuff in terms of movement here. But let's get more into how the layout actually works. I'm going to reset. Um, and first, I think we're going to talk, so we need to talk about the underlying tree structure, which I actually, you can toggle seeing the tree structure here. And excuse me. I think first what I want to do is, well, I want to talk about the tree structure as a stumbling block. I think there's a few things. So I think doing the layout itself of tiling feels pretty good. I'll talk more about how it splits up later. But probably the most interesting thing is when you want to move tiles around. And I think a big stumbling block here is that is like has to do with everything you're doing in the end, is that you have to understand the underlying data structure to understand how you can move these tiles. And these look, I think, like sort of four split up into four spaces, and they all seem equal. And so maybe you want to move these around. And all the movement keys, so you move the cursor with either Vim keys or the arrows in that direction. And then if you add shift to that, then you can start moving the tiles themselves. So if I go shift and down, I can swap these tiles. Go over here, I can do the same thing. Now what if I want to go shift and to the right? It feels like, it looks like I should be able to do the same thing. If you know the tile structure, you know that's not quite how it's going to work. But let's just get into it. Okay, first it has shifted the orientation of that split from vertical to horizontal. Press it again. It's now popped it out of that container. So now you kind of have three side by side in equal spaces. This third one contains two. I push it again, and I can select which tile I want to join it to. So I'm going to go top. So my overall goal here was to switch the moon and the matrix. And now I've done that, but compared to just being able to switch them, that's a little too far. Vertically, horizontally requires all of these extra movements, and that's because of the tree structure that underlies it. So that's a stumbling block, I think. So that was a mix of, I'm showing you the dilemma. You can also see some strategies I tried to mitigate that. And so this is all stuff I was used to in i3 and If you go to the i3 Reddit, you'll see a lot of people talking about like, why doesn't this layout do what I thought it would? And people saying, well, you got to understand there's a tree structure underlying it, and you got to get used to how that works. So I really wanted to explore if there was more intuitive ways to do that. A few strategies I tried to just make it easier to understand is I try and show you the parent. Let's do it. It's sort of easier to show without the images, which is maybe a problem. But the magenta box is the tile that's selected. Excuse me. And the parent gets this gray outline. So you can see, gets the wider gray outline. So you can see that um, this parent is in the vertical direction, and that's why it's so quick to split, because it doesn't have to move out and back into a parent. Here, that's the horizontal direction has changed. This, now its parent is through the whole page. Once it's in here, then it's with its other friend tile, and then it moves back out. So those are like some UI things I tried to do there to make it a little easier. I'm going to reset. And I think that helped. Um, and I'll get into even more of that in a second. But one other thing I want to mention while we're here is, so if that's the problem, like, can you do something that's not a tree? Um, I thought about this and I didn't figure out anything to do. So to try and show why it does need to be a tree for these types of layouts, you can resize tiles. So this is making that blue selected tile taller or shorter. And I think resizing here, like you would expect, it pushes on its neighbor. But it again acts differently if you're not acting within a parent. So if I try and go to the side, it's not just making this tile wider, it's also making its neighbor tile below it wider. It's actually resizing that whole parent, um, because that's, well, if you follow it through, so if it didn't do that, if it tried to just resize the blue's parent, then it would push that moon tile and you would be left with a gap between the bottom right corner of the selected tile. There would be space from where the moon had been shifted over, but because the sea beach wave scene is not all the way up, you would have a gap. So there's lots of examples like that, and that is why, that's what a tiling layout gets you, is that it covers all the screen space without any gaps. And the parent structure that causes you problems is necessary to be able to do that. I think. I still don't, I still am like, maybe there's some thing you could do. Like maybe there's another structure. As far as I can tell, there's not really, but I'd be interested to hear if somebody thinks you could use a different data structure that would somehow behave more intuitively in terms of feel. And if you, maybe you don't change the data structure, but maybe there is something to do that's sort of more in the movement code. Maybe you handle the case where these are perfectly aligned. I'm not sure. I think they are there. Then maybe you rearrange the parents on the fly, so you could push over the moon and the parents change orientation. And I thought about that a bit, and like whether you could have almost, it'd be like tracks, and if this slips into the tracks, right, then it can push over there, even though that's not how it was set up. Because I don't love that you have to keep in mind a data structure that you're not actually, that isn't actually visible. But I think that would require a lot of edge case code, and I don't know if it switches and then you want to kind of switch back. You won't necessarily be able to switch back, and how weird does that feel? there's already a fair amount of like edge case, special case handling in the code for this, so I didn't want to go further with that. But it is something that still makes me curious about. But the larger point is it needs to be a tree, I think, in order to make sure there's no gaps. And that's why you have to deal with some of the movement stuff. Um, and I went through a little bit of the things I tried to do to make that better, like trying to show you what parent is focused. Um, what do I want to do? I want to clear all these and we'll just do the outlines again. Um, One thing is interesting. So one place where I did take an approach that is kind of doesn't use the data structure as much as what's on the screen is the cursor movement. So just selecting the cursor, the tile with the cursor, and there, I mean, it's a lot easier because the layout stays static and you're just moving within the layout. If you're moving a tile, then you're also readjusting the layout and moving the cursor. So it's easier, and sort of because of that, I was able to, this is not based on the underlying tree structure, it's based on what tiles are actually on the screen next to this tile. So here I'm going to the right, and there's actually two neighboring tiles there. Like I'm going out of a parent, but it looks at the top left corner and finds the tile that borders it that contains, in this case, since it's moving horizontally, it finds the tile that it contains the parent, no, contains the y coordinate of the tile I'm moving from. Let me do that. And that results, so in the code wise, it's like I use the data and the tree layout sort of to lay out all these tiles. I keep a record of their positions, and then as I'm doing this cursor movement, it's just looking at those actual like XY positions, um, which is, I don't know, I think it was the right choice here. I3 doesn't do that. I3, I think as you're moving between parents, if you move to a container, it goes to the last active child within that container, which has a certain logic for applications that maybe you're switching back and forth between two applications and that works, but I find it actually feels like a pretty unpredictable. So that's one thing I wanted to try and do something different with. And I did here. I think it feels good, but I do feel a little weird that the logic of it depends on position, so it sort of diverges from the tree logic. Um, there's that tree again, and this is just all over the place. Yeah, but that's what I did. I think it was the right choice. Um, Let me see what else I wanted to talk about. Uh, One thing that I isn't too much to mention, but so there is a key for selecting the parent, which I've been doing a lot here. There's these tiles themselves which can hold images, and then you can also select the parent, select the parent, select the parent all the way up to the root of the rectangle. And then you can resize that, and you can even move that parent as kind of as if it's a single tile. There's like a very recursive structure here where a container is just a tile with some special attributes in it, and that means you can move these around, which seems interesting and fun to me. Let me talk about how we split images up. So in i3 by default, so let's talk about what a split is. You hit enter to split, and let's even clear the image out, and that splits it. vertically. It's weird to say either it's a vertical split, but it splits it into two horizontal spaces. Then this split again splits it vertically, splits it horizontally, vertically, horizontally. You could reverse that. Um, in i3, by default, although this isn't how I have it configured, so it doesn't help to show that, you choose whether you want a vertical or horizontal split. So you have one selected, and then it'll keep slicing that up. And in a lot of ways, that seems like a good default to me, like let the user choose. Don't try and do something magic. But it turns out, so I use in i3 an auto tiling script that someone made, linked in the release notes, that automatically splits on the longest dimension. And so after I'd been using i3 for a while, I tried that and I was really impressed with how often it split in exactly the way I wanted things to. It makes a lot of sense. Like if you want to run an application, you probably want as much space as possible, like as much evenly distributed space as possible, which means as square-like as possible. So if you do the i3 by default, where it's always set to 1, and you just hit enter, 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 you'll get these increasingly narrow strips. But so I have the same logic as I was talking about with that auto tiling script implemented here, that as you go down, it splits on the longest dimension and it gets you this nice um, kind of spirally ratio thing going. Um, that was great, and that feels great. Another, I could have like given you multiple keys. I thought about that. Um, So you could do a vertical split with one key and a horizontal split with another. But I kind of like that you can idly move around here and split things up and don't have to think too much about it. And there's sort of like one main action for splitting. And then if you want to change the orientation, it's like one move away. So if you wanted um, this to actually be a vertical split, then you could hit it and move it over there. I did do shift enter, which selects the first child in the split rather than the last, which is the default on enter. So using that, you can kind of reverse spiral, um, which is kind of fun. Random thing, if you select a parent, I let you select a bunch of images to input, and it'll fill those in order. So it didn't have enough to fill. But you can kind of build a layout and then just flood fill it with a bunch of stuff. And actually, it might have been a little glitch. If you choose just one, it'll try and fill everything with those, which gets a little intense. I'm going to reset that. All right. That was the kind of guided tour. A few last things, which actually gets to, I haven't talked much about specifically how this deals with images, which kind of reflects what I was doing. I wanted to explore this as a window manager, but it is true that like you can add images to in each of these tiles, and then you can save the result as an image. And there's like a save preview, which is Shift P here, that shows without the layout effect. So this is the image you can save where they're right next to each other. So a few things I did with images is one, relatively late in the game, I realized with the window manager, when you open a new application and that's what takes the place in the next split, here I realized if you're splitting on an image, both new children should just have that image, which gets you this like multiply split effect. It's like osmosis. I think osmosis is the reverse, but um, something like cells splitting and multiplying that is kind of a fun effect. That was kind of a fun late discovery. Another thing with images is they have a fill type, or this was my choice, I guess, which is a convention from a lot of stuff, including CSS. So the default fill type is stretch, where the images dimensions are stretched to fit the tile, and that doesn't respect the image's aspect ratio at all. You can change it to contain, which does keep the aspect ratio but contains it within the tile, or fill, which you see on on the web, like make sure it fills the container and tries to center the image in the dimension where it overlaps the edges. Um, Stretch is probably the weirdest thing um, to use, because usually you try and respect the image aspect ratio, but I thought for this experience it was the most interesting. One last thing I realized I didn't talk about with movement. So I got into why the quad is weird. I said some of the stuff I did to try and make it less weird. Another thing I did is this child choice. So you have this here, and then you're moving, I'm pressing shift arrow to the right, and it's moving it into this next container. And I'm saying, I'm guessing that you want to move it into one of these child tiles, and here I'm letting you choose which one, and then you can confirm that, and then it's in there. And that was again an attempt to make moving between parents a smoother experience. I think it was a good one, but it is weird. Sort of, because so you can see as I move it out. So actually it's moving out, it's like progressively jumping out of the containers, and this is back to where it was. And I could and did for a while have this so it moves into containers more incrementally, but I'm making the guess you maybe want to move it all the way in, and if you don't, you can move it back out manually. And that was probably one of the thorniest. I do like it. I keep like thinking through whether I like it or not. And that's not something that's an i3. I'm not really sure it should be. Um, but that is like kind of an interaction that I wasn't expecting at the beginning, that I tried out and that I'm happy with. And it gets pretty weird as you move in and out here. Then once you're outside, it's kind of, let's do some really weird stuff. Like I was saying, if you select a parent, you can actually move that all the way in. And that's a really recursive thing that I think is cool. All right. So that is, I think, for real, the last thing I really wanted to talk about. I don't know, what am I going to do next? I might try and I'll definitely do more tile experiments. Like I said, I think it's a really interesting layout, especially in comparison to a grid and cursor where you move from the inside out. I might try stuff that combines them. Probably more splitting up of an image. I love the just pressing enter to do stuff and then moving stuff around within kind of the structure you've created. Thanks for listening. This was a long one because it turns out I have tiling is this question of how to like make it more intuitive, and the logic behind it is super interesting to me, but you do have to go into, here's the crazy tile layout at this point. You do have to kind of understand the data structure that's involved there, and it's, I don't know, I think it's interesting to think about. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, this is one of a series of experiments at Constraint Systems, which you should check out.